Emma, a woman in the early stages of her pregnancy, had always found solace in the quiet moments she shared with her husband, Peter. The two of them had spent the evening enjoying a peaceful dinner at their favorite restaurant. The small, intimate atmosphere of the place had allowed them to relax and unwind from the busy demands of their everyday lives. Emma, now 6 months pregnant, was glowing with the excitement and anticipation of motherhood, while Peter's protective nature only seemed to grow stronger as the weeks passed. As they left the restaurant, the cool evening air greeted them as they walked hand in hand toward the train station, their usual mode of transportation for getting home. The station, although bustling with the usual mix of commuters and travelers, was still an environment that Emma found familiar and comfortable. It was a place she had passed through countless times, never imagining that tonight would be any different. The rhythmic sound of the trains arriving and departing, the soft murmur of conversations around her, and the gleam of the station lights overhead all made her feel safe. It was just another ordinary evening, or so she thought. With the comforting hum of the city in the background, Emma and Peter made their way toward the platform, their footsteps in sync as they moved toward the train. There was no rush, no urgency, just the natural flow of their evening as they prepared to board the train that would take them home. The sound of the train's arrival was a welcome one. It marked the final leg of their journey, the moment when they could finally relax and head to their warm bed. But as they approached the platform, Emma noticed something unusual. 2 police officers stood nearby, one of them scanning the crowd, the other engaged in a conversation with a passerby. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another pair of officers doing their rounds. However, as Emma and Peter reached the edge of the platform, one of the officers turned and began walking in their direction. He moved swiftly, as if he had been waiting for them, as if something about their presence had caught his attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer called out sharply, his tone more commanding than Emma had anticipated. "Can I see your ID?" The question was sudden, and the officer's demeanor was equally abrupt. Emma paused for a moment, surprised by the request, but Peter, ever the protector, stepped forward to address the situation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Peter asked, his voice calm but assertive. Emma was confused, unsure why they were being singled out. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here they were, standing in front of an officer demanding to see her identification. "Just need to check," the officer responded curtly, not offering any explanation. "Please show me your ID." Emma, still feeling uneasy, reached into her bag and handed over her identification without question. She wasn't sure why the officer had targeted them, but she knew that arguing wouldn't help. She just wanted to get on the train and go home. The officer glanced at her ID, then handed it back to her without a word. Emma was about to turn away when the second officer approached, his demeanor no less harsh than the first. "You're not going anywhere until we finish our check," he said firmly, blocking their path. "Stay right here." Confusion and anxiety began to creep in as Emma and Peter exchanged glances. This was more than just a simple request to show identification. Something about the officers' attitudes, their tone, and their behavior felt off. They were not being treated like ordinary citizens, but like suspects in some vague, undefined crime. As the seconds ticked by, the situation began to feel increasingly tense. Emma's heart started to race, the unease she had initially felt growing into a palpable sense of fear. She glanced around, hoping for someone to intervene. But the station seemed to be filled with people who were either unaware of the growing tension or too frightened to act. Little did Emma know, the night she thought would end peacefully would take a dark and terrifying turn. The officers, who seemed like nothing more than part of the routine of city life, were about to reveal a side of their power that would change everything. Emma's calm evening would soon dissolve into a nightmare, and the consequences of that moment would reverberate long after the train had passed. The tension between Emma, Peter, and the police officers quickly escalated as they stood on the edge of the platform, the cold air wrapping around them like an invisible barrier. Emma's heart began to pound in her chest, the normal rhythm of the evening now shattered by the unexpected presence of the 2 officers. She glanced at Peter, who was usually the calm and collected one in situations like this, but even he seemed uneasy. He tried to maintain a composed exterior, but the edge of his voice betrayed the frustration and confusion building inside him. "Officer, we haven't done anything wrong," Peter said, his tone steady but firm. "Can you please explain what this is all about?" The first officer, a tall man with a stern expression, remained silent for a moment, as though considering how to respond. His eyes never left Emma, and the way he scrutinized her made her feel exposed, like she was being judged before she even had the chance to speak. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "We have reason to believe that you're involved in something suspicious. We're just doing our job and checking IDs." Emma's stomach twisted at his words. Suspicious? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She was simply a pregnant woman heading home after a peaceful dinner with her husband. There was nothing out of the ordinary about her appearance or behavior. She had not seen anyone she recognized or acted in any way that might warrant suspicion. And yet, the officer's cold gaze seemed to suggest otherwise. Peter took a step forward, his protective instincts kicking in as he positioned himself between Emma and the officer. "What do you mean suspicious? Are you saying my wife has done something wrong?" His voice was sharp, his posture defensive. The officer did not flinch. Instead, he maintained his rigid stance, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were sizing Peter up. "I'm not saying she's done anything wrong, but we're checking all IDs in this area. It's standard procedure," the officer responded, his words lacking any real explanation. His vague answers did little to ease the growing unease in Emma's chest. Peter wasn't buying it. His voice grew more insistent. "There's no reason for you to be checking us. We've done nothing wrong. This is harassment." The second officer, shorter but no less imposing, stepped forward now, his eyes scanning the crowd around them before focusing on Emma and Peter. His demeanor was even more severe than the first officer's. "You can either comply with our check, or we can take this further. I suggest you don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unnerving. Emma felt a chill run down her spine, and for a brief moment, she considered simply walking away. But the second officer's words made that impossible. They were trapped. The sheer authority in their voices made it clear that there was no room for negotiation. Peter's jaw clenched. "We're not going anywhere until you explain what's going on." His stance was firm, but Emma could feel the tension in his body, his muscles rigid with frustration. Emma, still in shock, had not said much up until that point. She was struggling to make sense of the situation. Her mind swirled with questions. Why were they being singled out? Why were they being treated this way? She had done nothing wrong. All they wanted to do was catch the train and go home. But with each passing second, it seemed that their desire for peace was becoming more and more out of reach. As the seconds dragged on, Emma's discomfort grew. The officer's lack of explanation and the dismissive tone in their voices made her feel as though she was being painted into a corner. The growing crowd around them only added to the pressure. Passengers passed by without sparing them a glance, unaware of the tension mounting at the edge of the platform. Emma's unease morphed into something deeper, an instinctual sense that something wasn't right, that this encounter was not just about checking IDs, but something more sinister. "Please," Emma finally spoke up, her voice soft but strained. "We're just trying to get home. Why are you doing this to us? What's really going on?" The second officer glanced at her for the first time, his expression unreadable. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment too long before he looked back at Peter. "We don't have to explain ourselves to you. Just stay put," he barked, his tone final, as though the conversation was over. The words stung, but Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and tried to remain calm. This was not the way she had imagined her evening ending. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but she felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She was pregnant, she was tired, and she was at the mercy of two officers who seemed to be acting on a whim, without offering any explanation for their actions. Peter stepped back slightly, his hand still resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to control his anger. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, but his voice was laced with frustration. "We've done nothing wrong." The first officer eyed them both, his gaze cold and impassive. If you don't want this to escalate, I suggest you cooperate. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Why were they being treated like this? Was it something they had said or done? Or was it simply that they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time? She wished she had more information, but all she could do was stand there, feeling like she was slowly losing control of the situation. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the second officer stepped forward again. "We're not going to ask you again," he warned, his voice more threatening this time. "Stay where you are and don't make a scene." Emma's heart was pounding, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The more the officers spoke, the less she felt like herself. She was no longer just a pregnant woman on her way home. She was a target. And the officer's behavior was pushing her into a corner where she had no choice but to comply. It was then that Emma realized just how far this situation could go. The officers had control, and she and Peter were at their mercy. The fear of the unknown began to take root, and she wondered just how much of this was truly about security and how much of it was about power. Power that she and Peter had no choice but to submit to. As they stood there, trapped between the platform and the officers, the world around them seemed to grow quieter. The noise of the station, the bustle of the people, the sound of the trains arriving and departing, all of it faded into the background as Emma's thoughts spiraled. The fear, the confusion, and the frustration built to an overwhelming crescendo. Little did Emma know, this was only the beginning of an encounter that would change the course of her life. A moment when the unexpected would unravel into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. The atmosphere around Emma and Peter grew heavier with each passing moment. As the police officer's behavior became increasingly aggressive, what had started as an unsettling encounter had now taken a more sinister turn. The officers, who initially presented themselves as calm enforcers of the law, were now displaying an unsettling level of authority, using their uniforms to impose fear rather than to ensure security. Emma could feel the weight of their gaze, and her pulse quickened as the realization sank in. They were no longer just two individuals in a routine check. They were subjects of something far darker. Peter stood rigidly beside Emma, his arm protectively around her. His usual calm demeanor was slipping, replaced by a simmering anger that, despite his efforts, was beginning to show in his clenched fists and the tightness of his jaw. Every word the officers spoke felt like a thinly veiled threat. They weren't just trying to do their jobs, they were exerting control, pushing the boundaries of their authority. The sense of power they wielded over Emma and Peter was palpable, suffocating, and it was clear they had no intention of letting go of it anytime soon. The second officer, the shorter one who had been the more vocal of the two, stepped closer now, his face inches from Peter's. The air between them crackled with tension. "I told you to cooperate. This is your last warning," he said, his voice low but laced with an unmistakable threat. There was no room for negotiation in his tone, no attempt to explain why they were being detained. Just an ultimatum: comply or face consequences. Peter, now visibly shaking with anger, took a step back, holding his ground. "I've been asking for an explanation this whole time. You haven't given us one. You're overstepping your bounds." His voice had grown louder now, but still, there was no fear in it, only the conviction that this wasn't right. "You're abusing your power." Emma could feel her heart race as the officer's eyes flashed with irritation at Peter's words. He looked down at Peter with an almost dismissive expression, as if he had heard these kinds of complaints 1,000 times before and was uninterested in the personal grievances of those he held in his grasp. The second officer straightened up, his posture becoming even more imposing. "Abuse of power?" he scoffed. "You think you can talk to me like that? You don't know who you're dealing with." The officer's words hit Emma like a slap in the face, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur around her. It wasn't just the officer's words that stung, it was the sheer arrogance, the sense of superiority that oozed from every word. They weren't here to keep the peace. They weren't interested in protecting her or Peter. They were here to exert dominance, to remind them that they were nothing but subjects under their control, helpless to escape the situation. Peter's response was immediate, sharp, and full of fire. "No, I know exactly who you are, and this is wrong. What you're doing is wrong." Emma felt a wave of dizziness pass over her, as the tension reached its breaking point. She wasn't sure whether it was the hormones of her pregnancy or the pressure of the situation, but she suddenly felt lightheaded, like the ground beneath her was giving way. She had never been in a confrontation like this before. She had never imagined herself in a position where her own safety and dignity would be questioned so blatantly by those meant to protect her. The first officer, who had been silent up until this point, now took a step forward, his voice cold and calculated. "That's enough," he said, his eyes narrowing with warning. "You're crossing a line. If you don't calm down, we'll be forced to take you in. Is that what you want?" Emma's breath hitched at the officer's words. "Take us in," she whispered, barely able to comprehend the threat. The idea that they might be arrested, that they might be forced into a situation where they had no control, no recourse, it felt surreal. They had done nothing wrong. This was just a routine check, wasn't it? What was happening? But the officer's eyes told a different story. There was no sense of duty in their expressions, no professionalism, no courtesy, just a desire to dominate, to prove that they had the power to do whatever they pleased. Emma's stomach churned as she realized that this encounter had taken a dangerous turn. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was terrified for Peter, too. If they were arrested, if they were taken away, who would protect her? Who would take care of the baby? She looked at Peter, her heart breaking at the sight of his eyes wide, desperate, yet still filled with defiance. He wasn't going to back down. She knew that. But neither of them was prepared for the next move the officers would make. Without warning, the second officer grabbed Peter's arm roughly, his fingers digging into his skin with enough force to make Peter flinch. "I said, enough," the officer snarled, twisting Peter's arm slightly as if to emphasize his authority. Emma gasped, her hand instinctively reaching out to Peter. But she froze as the officer's grip tightened. Her mind screamed for her to do something, anything, but she felt paralyzed. There was nothing she could do. The pain in Peter's eyes, the way he looked at Emma as though he were silently apologizing for being unable to protect her in that moment, was more than she could bear. "Let go of him," Emma found herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was trying to reason with the officer or herself, but she couldn't let it go on like this. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about what this moment symbolized. The abuse of power wasn't just a matter of one officer's overstep. It was the systemic misuse of authority, the impunity that allowed such actions to happen, again and again, with no consequences. The first officer stepped in at that moment, speaking in a tone that was no less menacing than the second. "You've had your chance to cooperate. Now, you're both under arrest." His words were cold, final, as though this was no longer up for debate. The crushing weight of the situation pressed down on Emma's chest, and she realized with a sickening certainty that there was no turning back from this. As the officers began to move, pulling Peter away from her, Emma felt a rush of helplessness flood over her. She had never been so powerless. The fear coursing through her veins was sharp, blinding, but even through the terror, a small spark of defiance began to flicker within her. They were wrong. This was wrong. No matter how much they tried to exert their authority, Emma knew that she couldn't, and wouldn't, let them take control of this moment, of their lives, without fighting back. And so, in that quiet, heart-wrenching moment, Emma realized that she would do whatever it took to stand up for what was right, even if it meant challenging the very people who were supposed to protect her. As the officers began to pull Peter away, Emma felt a cold wave of panic seize her heart. Every step they took toward the police car seemed to send a tremor through her entire body. She watched helplessly, rooted to the spot, as Peter's face contorted with frustration and defiance. His struggles were futile. There were two officers, their hands gripping him like iron, making it clear they were determined to make an example out of him. The cold grip of fear clutched at Emma's chest, but deep down, beneath the fear, something else stirred within her, a flicker of determination. However small, her thoughts raced, her mind trying desperately to find a solution, a way to break through this nightmare. She couldn't just stand there and let them take him. Peter wasn't just her partner. He was the father of her child, her protector, her equal, and she had to protect him, just as he had always protected her. But how? She was outnumbered, outmatched, and their voices seemed to get louder, more oppressive with each passing second. The officers, clearly eager to intimidate, were speaking over Peter, shouting at him to stop resisting. But all they succeeded in doing was pushing Emma further toward the edge. The situation was escalating quickly. Emma felt herself growing desperate, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the pressure built inside her. She could hear Peter's strained voice, a mix of anger and pain, as he tried to reason with the officers. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his body twisting in their grasp. "This isn't right. You can't do this." But the more he protested, the tighter their grip became, and the more the officers began to exert their power. Emma's gaze darted around, looking for any way out, any ally in sight. But the street was empty. The sound of their altercation echoed in the silence, the distant hum of traffic the only other noise in the background. Then, just as she thought she might lose her grip on the situation, something caught her eye, a figure in the distance, walking toward them with purpose. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It was hard to believe at first, but when the figure drew closer, she recognized him immediately. It was Jack, Peter's old friend from his time working in the legal field, someone they both trusted implicitly. Jack had always been a calm, composed presence in their lives, a man who seemed to know how to navigate situations like this with grace and intelligence. Emma's breath caught in her throat as he approached. He looked calm, but there was an unmistakable fire in his eyes, a hint of anger that had always been there beneath his easygoing demeanor. His gaze flicked between the officers and Peter, quickly assessing the situation. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" Jack's voice rang out, authoritative and strong. The officers paused for a brief moment, turning to face him, their expressions changing slightly. They hadn't expected interference, especially not from someone who seemed so unassuming at first glance. "We're handling this," the first officer replied, his tone dismissive. But there was a nervous edge now, something Jack's presence had provoked. He was clearly a threat in their eyes, someone who could potentially make their actions public, someone who had the power to turn the tables. Jack, unfazed, took another step closer, now standing directly in front of the officers. "Handling it? Looks more like you're abusing your power to me." His voice was steady, but there was a hint of steel behind it. "I know you're just doing your job, but this is excessive. You've got no reason to be treating him like this." The second officer, the one who had been the most aggressive with Peter, sneered. "You don't know what you're talking about. Step back, or you'll be next." But Jack didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze without hesitation. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and if you lay a hand on me, I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what's going on here. Is that what you want?" For a moment, there was silence, heavy and thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the standoff unfold. The officers exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. They hadn't expected this kind of pushback. Jack wasn't just a bystander. He was someone who could expose their actions. He was someone with the knowledge and resources to make their lives far more difficult if they continued down this path. Finally, the first officer spoke again, his voice less certain now. "We don't need this trouble." He glanced at the second officer, who was still holding Peter firmly. The officer hesitated, clearly weighing their options. After what felt like an eternity, the second officer finally released his grip on Peter, allowing him to step back. Peter, though shaken and clearly in pain, staggered a few steps away from the officers. His eyes never left Emma, as though he was afraid she might disappear if he looked away for too long. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but there was a faint spark of gratitude in his eyes as he stood beside her again. Jack, having successfully intervened, turned his attention back to the officers. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "You've crossed a line today, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The officers, realizing the situation had turned in their favor, began to back off. They could see the momentum slipping away from them. The power dynamic had shifted. The second officer muttered something under his breath before turning to walk away, the first officer following suit. clearly unwilling to escalate things further. As they walked back to their patrol car, Emma felt a small sense of relief, but it was tempered with the realization that what had just transpired wasn't just a personal encounter. It was a reminder of the power imbalance that existed between law enforcement and ordinary citizens. It was a stark illustration of the dangers that came with unchecked authority, and it had shaken her to her core. When the officers were finally out of sight, Jack turned back to Peter and Emma, his face softening. "Are you both okay?" His voice was low now, concern evident in his expression. Peter nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and lingering anger. "I'm fine," Peter said, though the shakiness in his voice betrayed the lie. "Thanks to you." Emma, still feeling the weight of the experience, nodded as well. "Yeah, thank you, Jack." Her voice was thick with emotion, her body still trembling from the adrenaline rush. The relief was starting to sink in, but she knew that the encounter had left its mark on all of them. It wasn't just about the immediate danger, there was something deeper, something unsettling about the way the officers had treated them, something they couldn't easily forget. Jack offered a small smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. We're going to get this investigated. No one should ever be treated like that. No one." As the three of them stood there, the tension slowly began to ease. The police officers had left, but the scars from the encounter would linger. Emma and Peter had narrowly escaped something much worse, but it was clear to them both that the fight wasn't over. The fight for their dignity, for their rights, had just begun. In the aftermath of the police encounter, the events seemed to unfold like a storm they had barely survived. Emma and Peter, still shaken by the violence and intimidation they had witnessed, now found themselves facing the reality of a legal battle. What had started as an ordinary day had spiraled into a fight for justice that neither of them had anticipated. The bruises on Peter's body were visible signs of the ordeal, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. They both knew that if they were to ensure this didn't happen again, not just to them, but to anyone else, they needed to take action. The decision to pursue legal action wasn't easy. Both Emma and Peter had always been cautious about drawing attention to themselves. They had lived quietly, keeping their heads down, trying to make a life that was as simple and peaceful as possible. They weren't activists, they weren't people who sought conflict. But after witnessing the brutality firsthand, it became undeniable. The system needed to be held accountable. Jack, their old friend, had been their first ally in the ordeal, and now he became their lifeline. Jack wasn't just a friend to Peter, he was a lawyer, someone who understood the ins and outs of the law. He had been instrumental in helping Peter during his previous legal struggles, and now, he stepped forward with the same dedication. He knew that what they had experienced was no isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue that needed to be exposed. "I'm going to help you both through this," Jack had said firmly after they had calmed down, gathered their thoughts, and began discussing their next steps. "We can file a formal complaint against the officers. We can't let them just get away with this." Peter had been hesitant at first. He had seen firsthand how the system could protect its own, even when they were in the wrong. The idea of going up against the police, especially with so little evidence beyond their word and the memory of a traumatic experience, made him nervous. It was a David versus Goliath situation, and he wasn't sure if they had the strength to win. "I don't know, Jack," Peter had said, rubbing his sore wrist where one of the officers had grabbed him. "What if this just makes things worse? What if they retaliate?" Jack had reassured him, explaining that they would take the necessary precautions and ensure their safety throughout the process. The key was to make the legal struggle public, by getting the media involved, by documenting every step of the process. They could put enough pressure on the authorities that it would be hard for them to cover up their wrongdoing. It wasn't about revenge, it was about creating accountability, about making sure that the next person didn't have to go through what Peter and Emma had just endured. The first step in the process was gathering evidence. Jack worked closely with Peter and Emma, helping them compile a detailed timeline of events from the moment they encountered the officers to when they were released. They documented their injuries, recorded their testimonies, and collected any relevant medical reports from Peter's visit to the hospital to address the bruises and wounds inflicted during the arrest. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, could be crucial. They also reached out to potential witnesses. A few passersby had seen what had happened. Though many had been too afraid to speak up, Jack encouraged them to talk, making it clear that they had the legal right to share their account of the events without fear of retribution. Some, though still hesitant, agreed to provide statements. Emma had also managed to find security footage from a nearby building that had captured part of the incident. The footage was grainy, but it showed enough to give credibility to their claims. With the evidence in hand, Jack filed an official complaint with the police department, demanding an internal investigation into the officer's conduct. At the same time, he sought legal counsel from external organizations that specialized in police misconduct cases. He had connections to advocacy groups that supported victims of police violence, and they were eager to lend their resources to the case. But the road to justice was anything but smooth. From the outset, the police department began to push back. They claimed that the officers involved had acted within the boundaries of their authority, even though the evidence clearly suggested otherwise. Internal investigations were launched, but the results were slow to come in, and they were far from transparent. Emma and Peter felt like they were running into a wall at every turn. It was clear that the system wasn't eager to investigate itself, and the longer the process dragged on, the more frustrated they became. Jack, however, was undeterred. He continued to press forward, knowing that the longer they waited, the harder it would be to hold the officers accountable. As the case gained traction, the media began to take notice. News outlets in the area picked up on the story, and soon, it was spreading like wildfire. The public outcry was swift, with many people expressing outrage over what had happened. The press coverage provided a much-needed sense of momentum, forcing the police department to pay attention. Despite the mounting pressure, the department continued to defend the officers. They claimed that Peter had resisted arrest and had provoked the officers. They pointed to the video footage, which, although unclear, could be interpreted in a way that supported their narrative. But the media wasn't buying it. They took a critical stance, demanding transparency and accountability. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about Peter and Emma anymore. It was about a larger issue of police brutality, the abuse of power, and the need for reform within the police force. As weeks passed, Jack worked tirelessly to prepare for the next phase of their legal battle, a public trial. The process was grueling. There were hearings, motions, and countless hours spent in meetings with legal experts. Emma and Peter often felt overwhelmed, but they knew that they had come too far to back down now. Their story was resonating with people, and they were determined to see it through to the end. Then came a turning point, just when it seemed like the case might stall or be swept under the rug. A key piece of evidence came to light. One of the officers involved, seemingly unaware of the ongoing investigation, had spoken about the incident to a fellow officer, an offhand remark that was overheard and later reported. In this conversation, the officer admitted that their actions had been excessive, that they had used unnecessary force. This confession, although informal, was enough to cast serious doubt on the credibility of the department's defense. With this new development, the pressure on the police department intensified. The internal investigation was reopened, and there was finally movement in the case. For the first time, Emma and Peter felt a glimmer of hope. They were no longer alone in their struggle. The public had taken their side, and the wheels of justice were slowly beginning to turn. In the end, after months of legal battles, media attention, and public scrutiny, the officers involved were held accountable for their actions. They were disciplined, though the outcome was less severe than Emma and Peter had hoped. Still, it was a victory, a hard-fought one, and it sent a message that police brutality would not be tolerated. But the struggle wasn't over. Emma and Peter knew that the road to true justice was long, and the system was far from perfect. However, they also knew that their fight had made a difference. It had sparked conversations, changed minds, and brought attention to an issue that could no longer be ignored. For Emma and Peter, the legal battle had been about more than just seeking justice for themselves. It had been about making sure that their experience wasn't in vain. And in that, they had succeeded. The aftermath of the legal battle had left Emma and Peter exhausted, both emotionally and physically. The bruises from their encounter with the police had faded, but the scars of the experience remained. Yet, despite the emotional toll and the long road they had traveled, they found themselves filled with a sense of accomplishment, an understanding that they had taken a stand, that they had fought not just for themselves, but for something much larger. Their case was not only about seeking justice for the trauma they had endured. It was about exposing the flaws within a system that had long been regarded as untouchable. In the end, the legal outcome was bittersweet. While the officers involved were reprimanded and the case received significant public attention, the reality of systemic change was far more complex. The victory, though significant, was small in comparison to the larger issues of police brutality and the abuse of power that plagued society. The officers had faced consequences for their actions, but they remained part of the system, part of a structure that, in many ways, had failed Emma and Peter from the start. But even with this recognition, the couple knew that this wasn't the end. The journey they had embarked upon had ignited a spark within them, a spark that refused to be extinguished. They had learned that, while the fight for justice could feel like an insurmountable challenge, it was not a battle that could be fought alone. It was a collective effort. Their experience had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless in the face of authority. It had proven that change, while difficult and slow, was possible. For Emma, the most important lesson was about the power of speaking up. Before this ordeal, she had always believed that the best way to navigate the world was quietly, without drawing attention to herself. The events they had experienced shattered that belief. She realized that silence in the face of injustice only allowed the problem to persist. By sharing their story, by speaking up against the wrongs they had witnessed, they had not only started a conversation but had given others the courage to do the same. It wasn't just their fight anymore. It was the fight of anyone who had ever felt marginalized, silenced, or oppressed. Their voice had become a tool of resistance. Peter, on the other hand, had come to understand the importance of resilience. When he had been assaulted by the officers, it felt like the weight of the world was crashing down on him. The fear and anger had nearly overwhelmed him. But as the days went on, as they gathered the evidence and fought back, he learned that resilience was not about never feeling fear. It was about continuing to move forward despite that fear. They had faced setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt, but they had never given up. They had chosen to stand firm, to confront the powers that sought to keep them down. In doing so, they had found a strength within themselves that they had not known existed. As they reflected on their journey, Emma and Peter also realized that this case was a part of something much larger. The issues they had faced, the mistreatment by the police, the slow pace of the justice system, the systemic nature of abuse, were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a societal issue that spanned beyond their small corner of the world. Their fight was a microcosm of the struggles faced by countless individuals, families, and communities who had suffered similar indignities. While their legal battle had been a personal one, it was also a reflection of the fight many others had been waging for years. It was a reminder that the work was not over. They had won a battle, but the war for justice and equality continued. And so, Emma and Peter's story became a message to those who had been wronged by the system, a message to those who felt powerless and voiceless, and a message to those who had the courage to fight. It was a call to action, a call to continue to stand up against injustice, to keep pushing for change, and to never allow the fear of retribution to silence their voices. Their victory was a testament to the importance of perseverance. It was a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against you, even when the system seems impossible to navigate, there is power in standing up and demanding what is right. It showed that individual actions could make a difference. By challenging the status quo, by pushing back against the powers that be, Emma and Peter had shown that justice was not a passive state, but an active pursuit. As they continued on with their lives, they knew they had changed. The experience had shaped them, had reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be an active participant in society. It was no longer enough to simply live quietly in the shadows. They had learned that standing up for justice, no matter how difficult, was the only way to create a world that was better for everyone. Their actions had rippled outwards. sparking a larger conversation and inspiring others to join in the fight for a more just and equitable society. The message was clear. No one should have to suffer in silence, and no one should fear standing up for what is right. Emma and Peter had become part of a movement toward accountability, transparency, and justice. They knew that there was still work to be done, but they also knew that the first step in any fight for justice was to speak up, and that they had done. They had spoken up for themselves, for others, and for a future where no one had to endure what they had experienced.